The fluorescent lights in the U.S. Embassy waiting room buzzed like angry wasps as I sat alone, clutching my folder of meticulously organized documents. The chair beside me remained empty, a glaring reminder that my husband of 3 years had just walked out on the most important appointment of our lives together. 20 minutes ago, David Morrison had kissed my forehead, whispered, "Good luck with your little interview," and disappeared into the London morning, leaving me to face our spousal visa application alone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But David had made one critical miscalculation. He thought I was the same naive woman who'd fallen for his charm 5 years ago. He had no idea that his helpless wife had spent the last 6 months building connections that would make his betrayal the biggest mistake of his corporate climbing career. The morning had started like any other Tuesday in our Kensington flat, except for the knot of anxiety that had been growing in my stomach for weeks. Immigration interviews weren't supposed to be solo performances, especially not spousal visa interviews where the entire point was proving the legitimacy of your marriage. I'd been awake since 5, double-checking every document, every form, every piece of evidence that proved David and I were genuinely committed to building a life together in the United States. "Emma, you're going to be fine," David had said over his morning coffee, barely looking up from his phone as he scrolled through what I assumed were work emails. "It's just a formality. These immigration officers see hundreds of cases like ours every month. British business consultant marries American executive, wants to move to the States for better opportunities. Standard procedure." I'd nodded, trying to calm my nerves, but something in his tone felt off, dismissive, like he was talking about a routine dental cleaning rather than the legal process that would determine whether we could start the next chapter of our lives together. David had been working in London for his American company for 4 years, and when his transfer back to New York came through, we'd both agreed it was the perfect opportunity for me to expand my consulting business into the U.S. market. Or at least, that's what I'd thought we'd agreed on. The embassy building itself was imposing, all concrete and security barriers that made you feel small before you even walked through the metal detectors. We'd arrived together that morning, David looking polished as always in his charcoal Armani suit, the one he wore to important client meetings. I'd chosen my navy dress carefully, professional but approachable, the kind of outfit that said, "Responsible potential American resident," without trying too hard. "Mrs. Morrison?" The security guard had checked our names against his list. "Interview room C, 2nd floor. Both of you?" "Both of us," David had confirmed, but his eyes were already wandering toward the exit. Though I might need to step out for a quick call. Work emergency brewing. Even then I should have known. David always had work emergencies when things got uncomfortable or required his actual emotional presence. When my mother had been hospitalized last year, he'd had an urgent client crisis. When my consulting firm had won its biggest contract and I'd wanted to celebrate, suddenly there was a fire to put out at the London office. Work was David's default excuse for avoiding anything that required him to be fully present in our relationship. The waiting room on the 2nd floor was beige and institutional, filled with couples holding hands and speaking in nervous whispers. Some clutched thick folders like mine, others had children balanced on their laps while they waited. Everyone looked anxious, but they all had one thing in common that I was about to lose. They had their spouses beside them. "Mr. and Mrs. Morrison?" The immigration officer who called our names was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and the sort of efficient demeanor that comes from years of processing human hopes and dreams through government bureaucracy. "I'm Officer Patricia Williams, if you'll follow me." David stood immediately, straightening his tie in that unconscious gesture he made whenever he was about to perform. Because that's what our entire marriage had been for him, I was beginning to realize. A performance. He was the successful American executive with the smart, accomplished wife who made him look stable and mature. I was the supporting actress in the story of his brilliant career. Interview room C was smaller than I'd expected. Just a desk, 3 chairs, and a window that looked out onto the busy London street below. Officer Williams settled behind her desk and opened our file, which looked reassuringly thick with all the documentation we'd submitted over the past months. "This should be straightforward," she said with a smile that was meant to be reassuring. "I just need to verify a few details about your relationship and your plans in the United States. Standard questions to establish the authenticity of your marriage." That's when David's phone buzzed. Loudly. He glanced at it with the sort of urgency that made my stomach drop. "I'm so sorry," he said, already standing. "This is the client emergency I mentioned. I need to take this call immediately. Emma can handle the questions. She's much better with details anyway." Officer Williams looked puzzled. "Mr. Morrison, this is a joint interview. I need to speak with both of you together. That's how spousal visa interviews work." David was already backing toward the door, phone pressed to his ear in a gesture that looked rehearsed. "I understand, but this is $1 million deal on the line. Emma knows everything about our relationship, our plans, our finances. She can answer anything you need to know." He looked at me then, and for just a moment, his mask slipped. The smile was cold, calculated. "Can't you, sweetheart?" And then, he was gone, just walked out of the interview room, out of the embassy, out of what was supposed to be our shared future. I sat there staring at the closed door, my carefully organized folders suddenly feeling like a prop in a play I hadn't realized I was performing in alone. Officer Williams cleared her throat gently. "Mrs. Morrison, I'm afraid I can't proceed with the interview without your husband present. The spousal visa application requires both parties to be available for questioning. We'll need to reschedule." The word reschedule hit me like ice water. Rescheduling meant waiting another 3 months for an available appointment slot. It meant David's transfer to New York would go through without me. It meant I'd be stuck in London while my husband started his new life in America, free to make whatever choices suited him without the inconvenience of his wife's immigration status hanging over his head. That's when I understood. This wasn't a work emergency, this was David's exit strategy. I sat in that beige interview room for another 10 minutes, ostensibly gathering my documents but really trying to process what had just happened. Officer Williams was patient, clearly having dealt with nervous spouses before, but she kept glancing at the clock. She had other interviews scheduled, other couples whose marriages she needed to evaluate for authenticity. My phone buzzed with a text from David. "Sorry about the call. Emergency meeting ran long. You can handle the interview solo. See you at home tonight. Handle the interview solo." Like it was a dinner reservation I could manage on my own, rather than a legal proceeding that required both of us. Like my future in America was a minor inconvenience he could delegate to me while he dealt with more important matters. I stared at that text message and felt something shift inside me. Not heartbreak, not anger, but a cold, clear understanding of exactly who my husband really was. David Morrison was a man who had abandoned his wife at the most crucial moment of their immigration process because it was convenient for him, because he'd already decided that my presence in his American life was optional. But David had made his calculation based on incomplete information. He thought I was dependent on him, that I needed his support and sponsorship to build a life in America. He thought I was just another trailing spouse, following her successful husband wherever his career took him. What he didn't know was that I'd been building my own connections, my own opportunities, my own power base. And one of those connections was sitting 3 floors above us in the same embassy building, behind a door marked Cultural Attaché. Michael Rodriguez and I had worked together 2 years ago, when his office had hired my consulting firm to analyze cross-cultural business practices for American companies, expanding into European markets. What had started as a professional relationship had become a genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared experiences as Americans living abroad. Michael understood the complexities of international business in ways that David, for all his corporate success, never had. More importantly, Michael understood loyalty, and he was about to discover exactly how little loyalty my husband possessed. I stood up from my chair and smiled at Officer Williams with a confidence that surprised us both. "Officer Williams, I'd like to make a phone call before we reschedule. Would that be possible?" She glanced at her watch. "Of course, Mrs. Morrison. Take your time." I stepped into the hallway and dialed Michael's extension from memory. He answered on the second ring. "Emma? What are you doing calling the embassy number?" "I'm in the building, Michael. 2nd floor, Immigration Services. And I need a favor." There was a pause, and when Michael spoke again, his voice had shifted into the careful, diplomatic tone he used when something serious was happening. "What kind of favor?" The kind where my husband just abandoned me at our spousal visa interview, and I'm about to be royally screwed over unless someone with actual authority intervenes. Another pause, longer this time. Stay exactly where you are. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I'll be down in 5 minutes. Michael Rodriguez was the sort of man who commanded attention without trying. Tall, silver-haired, with the bearing of someone who'd spent 20 years navigating international diplomacy and corporate politics. When he stepped off the elevator and approached our interview room, Officer Williams straightened in her chair in a way that told me she recognized both his face and his authority. "Officer Williams," Michael said, extending his hand with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. "Michael Rodriguez, cultural attaché. I understand there's been an unusual situation with Mrs. Morrison's interview?" "Mr. Rodriguez," Officer Williams replied, clearly surprised to see a senior embassy official involved in what should have been a routine spousal visa case. "Yes, Mr. Morrison had to leave for what he described as a work emergency. We were just discussing rescheduling." Michael glanced at me, and I saw him register the controlled fury I was trying to keep off my face. He'd known me long enough to read my expressions, and he was putting pieces together faster than I would have expected. "Officer Williams, would it be possible for me to observe this interview? Mrs. Morrison has been providing consulting services for several of our cultural exchange programs. Her work has been exemplary, and frankly, we have a vested interest in retaining access to her expertise." It was a masterful move. Michael was inserting official embassy interest into my case without directly interfering with immigration procedures. Officer Williams nodded slowly, clearly weighing protocols against the reality of a senior attaché taking personal interest in an interview. "Of course, Mr. Rodriguez. Though I should mention that spousal visa interviews typically require both parties to be present." "Typically, yes," Michael agreed, settling into the chair David had vacated. "Though I believe there are provisions for unusual circumstances, particularly when one party demonstrates a pattern of unreliability that might itself be relevant to the authenticity assessment." Officer Williams raised an eyebrow. "Pattern of unreliability?" That's when I realized Michael wasn't just observing. He was about to help me turn David's abandonment into evidence against his own character. My diplomat friend was offering me the chance to reframe this entire situation, and all I had to do was tell the truth about my marriage. "Officer Williams," I said, opening my folder with steady hands, "I'd like to revise my application approach. Instead of presenting this as a joint spousal petition, I'd like you to consider the evidence of my husband's commitment to our marriage based on his actions today and over the past several months." I pulled out my phone and showed her David's text message. My husband knew this interview was scheduled for 3 months. He knew it required both of us to be present. He knew that his absence would jeopardize my immigration status. I paused, letting that sink in. And he chose to leave anyway because he had what he called a more important meeting. Officer Williams read the text carefully, then looked at Michael, who nodded encouragingly. "Mrs. Morrison," she said slowly, "are you suggesting that your husband deliberately sabotaged this interview?" "I'm suggesting that my husband has shown a consistent pattern of prioritizing his career over our marriage, including today when he abandoned me at the most important legal proceeding of our relationship." I took a breath, feeling something like relief flood through me. And I think that pattern raises serious questions about whether this marriage meets the standards for immigration purposes. Michael leaned forward slightly. "Officer Williams, might I suggest that Mrs. Morrison's professional qualifications and character references could support an individual petition, if she chooses to pursue that route?" It was a lifeline I hadn't expected, but one I was suddenly eager to grab. Because sitting in that interview room, abandoned by my husband and supported by a friend who understood my actual value, I realized I didn't want to be Mrs. David Morrison in America. I wanted to be Emma Chen, successful consultant who'd earned her place through her own merit. "I'd like to explore that option," I said firmly. "And I'd like to formally document my husband's abandonment of this process as evidence that this marriage may not meet the good faith requirements for spousal immigration." Officer Williams was writing notes now, her expression shifting from routine processing to genuine interest. "Mrs. Morrison, this is highly unusual, but given the circumstances and Mr. Rodriguez's involvement, I think we can proceed with a modified interview focused on your individual qualifications and the legitimacy concerns you've raised." That's when my phone rang. David's ringtone. I looked at Michael, who nodded once, then answered it on speaker. "Emma, how did the interview go?" David's voice filled the small room, confident and casual, like he was asking about a dentist appointment he'd skipped. "Actually, David, the interview is still ongoing. Officer Williams, would you like to speak with my husband about why he left?" The silence on the other end of the phone was sharp enough to cut glass. Then David's voice came back, tighter now, with an edge of irritation. "Emma, what are you doing? Just tell them whatever they need to hear and we'll deal with the paperwork later." "Mr. Morrison," Officer Williams interrupted. "This is Patricia Williams, Immigration Services. I need to ask you directly why you left a mandatory joint interview for your wife's spousal visa application." Another pause, longer this time. When David spoke again, his tone had shifted into the corporate smooth talk he used when trying to manage difficult clients. "Officer Williams, I deeply apologize for the confusion. I had an urgent business matter that couldn't be postponed." I'm sure Emma explained that this was unavoidable. "Mr. Morrison, spousal visa interviews are scheduled months in advance specifically to allow applicants to plan around other commitments. Are you saying that your business obligations take priority over your wife's immigration status?" I watched Officer Williams' expression as she asked the question, and I could see her forming opinions about David's character in real time. This wasn't just about my visa anymore. This was about whether David Morrison was the kind of man who honored his commitments to his spouse. "Of course not," David said, but his voice carried the strain of someone trying to backpedal out of a position he hadn't realized he'd taken. "I simply thought Emma was capable of handling the interview on her own. She's very competent." "Mr. Morrison," Michael interjected, and I heard David's sharp intake of breath as he recognized a voice he wasn't expecting. "This is Michael Rodriguez, from the Cultural Attaché Office. I'm curious about your assessment of your wife's competence, given that you left her to handle a legal proceeding that specifically requires both parties to be present." The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Then David's voice came back, and all the corporate polish was gone, replaced by something much colder. "Who the hell is this? And why is he involved in my wife's immigration interview?" "David," I said quietly, "Mr. Rodriguez is a friend who's helping me understand my options, including options that don't involve you." "Emma, what are you talking about? We agreed on this plan months ago. You're coming to New York with me, we're starting fresh, building our careers together." "No, David. You made a plan that involved me following you to New York while you built your career. I never agreed to abandon my own professional goals to support yours." Officer Williams was taking notes furiously now, clearly documenting a conversation that was revealing far more about our marriage than any questionnaire could have captured. "Mr. Morrison," she said, "I'm required to assess whether spousal visa applications represent genuine marriages entered into for legitimate purposes. Based on today's events and this conversation, I have concerns about your commitment to your wife's well-being and immigration status. Are you questioning the legitimacy of my marriage?" David's voice was sharp with indignation. "We've been together for 5 years, married for 3. We have joint accounts, shared property, mutual friends. We're a legitimate couple." "Mr. Morrison," Michael said smoothly, "legitimacy isn't just about paperwork. It's about partnership, mutual support, and shared commitment to each other's success. Would you say that abandoning your wife at an immigration interview demonstrates those qualities?" I could practically hear David's teeth grinding through the phone. "I don't know what kind of game you people are playing, but Emma and I will be filing a complaint about this process. This is harassment." "David," I said, and my voice was steady as steel, "the only game being played here is the one where you thought you could manipulate me into being grateful for whatever scraps of consideration you chose to offer. But here's what you didn't consider." I looked at Michael, who nodded encouragingly, then at Officer Williams, who was watching me with something that looked like respect. "I don't need you to get to America. I don't need your sponsorship or your support or your permission. What I needed was a partner who would show up when it mattered. And you just proved that you're not that person." The silence on the phone was deafening. Then David's voice came back, and it was ugly with a rage I'd never heard from him before. "You think you're so smart, Emma? You think you can just throw away everything we've built together because I missed one appointment? You have no idea what you're giving up. No idea what this will cost you." "Actually, David, I think I'm beginning to understand exactly what this will cost me. And exactly what it's worth." I looked at Officer Williams. "I'd like to withdraw my spousal visa application and explore individual immigration options based on my professional qualifications." "Emma, don't you dare." I hung up the phone and turned it off completely. In the sudden silence of the interview room, I could hear my own heartbeat, steady and strong. "Mrs. Morrison," Officer Williams said slowly, "or would you prefer Ms. Chen? I think we need to have a very different conversation about your immigration goals." Michael smiled at me with something that looked like pride. "Emma, I think Officer Williams is right. And I think you're about to discover that you have far more options than your husband ever wanted you to know about." For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe completely. Because David Morrison had just made the biggest mistake of his calculated, self-serving life. He'd abandoned me at the moment when I needed him most, in front of witnesses who had the power to change everything. But more than that, he'd revealed his true character to people who mattered, people who could see the difference between a partnership and a performance. And now those same people were about to help me build something better than anything David could have offered me. The interview that was supposed to secure my place as David's dependent wife was about to become the beginning of my independent American dream, and my husband was about to learn that abandoning someone doesn't make them disappear. It just makes them free to choose better options. Officer Williams opened a new file folder and smiled at me with genuine warmth. "Ms. Chen, let's talk about what you can accomplish on your own." What David Morrison had never bothered to learn about his wife was that Emma Chen didn't just stumble into international consulting by accident. Her expertise in cross-cultural business analysis had been built over 8 years of methodical networking, strategic positioning, and a level of professional sophistication that David consistently underestimated. While he saw her work as a convenient hobby that kept her busy while he focused on his real career, Emma had been building relationships with government officials, cultural attachés, and business leaders across 3 continents. Michael Rodriguez wasn't just a friend who happened to work at the embassy. He was one of 12 diplomatic contacts Emma had cultivated through her consulting work, each one representing a different aspect of international business and governmental relations that most corporate executives never accessed. When David made jokes about Emma's little networking events and, quote, coffee meetings with bureaucrats, he was dismissing connections that had more real power than his entire corporate hierarchy. The irony was delicious. David spent his days managing relationships with clients who could cancel contracts or withhold bonuses. Emma spent her days building relationships with people who could open or close entire markets, facilitate or obstruct international operations, and make or break the regulatory environment that companies like David's depended on. She'd never mentioned this distinction to him because she'd assumed he understood the difference between transactional business relationships and strategic institutional partnerships. She'd been wrong about what he understood, but she'd been absolutely right about the value of those relationships. Officer Williams was studying the notes she'd taken during David's phone call, occasionally glancing at Michael as if trying to gauge whether his presence represented routine embassy interest or something more significant. Emma could see the moment when the immigration officer began to understand that this wasn't a standard case of spousal abandonment, but something that involved people with actual governmental authority taking personal interest in the outcome. "Ms. Chen," Officer Williams said carefully, "Mr. Rodriguez mentioned that you've been providing consulting services for embassy cultural programs. Could you elaborate on that relationship?" Emma opened her portfolio and extracted a folder she'd brought for backup documentation, though she'd never imagined needing it under these circumstances. Inside were letters of recommendation from 4 different embassy departments, contract summaries for projects spanning 2 years, and performance evaluations that consistently rated her work as exceptional. "I've been the primary consultant for the embassy's cross-cultural business initiative since its launch 18 months ago," Emma explained, handing the documents to Officer Williams. "The program helps American companies understand European business practices and regulatory environments when they're expanding internationally." My firm developed the assessment frameworks they use to evaluate market entry strategies. Michael nodded approvingly. Emma's work has been instrumental in helping American businesses avoid costly cultural missteps when establishing European operations. Her analysis of German business protocol alone saved 3 companies from significant regulatory violations in their first year of operations. Officer Williams was reading through the recommendation letters with increasing interest. Each one described Emma's work in terms that emphasized not just her competence, but her value to ongoing American business interests abroad. The embassy's Economic Affairs Office had written that her consulting services were considered essential to their mission of facilitating American economic expansion. The Commercial Services Department had recommended her for formal recognition of her contributions to U.S. business success in European markets. Ms. Chen, these recommendations are quite impressive, Officer Williams said. It appears that your professional qualifications for individual immigration would be substantially stronger than most applicants we see. Emma smiled, feeling a satisfaction she'd never experienced in 3 years of marriage to David. These recommendations represented her actual professional worth, assessed by people who understood the complexity and value of what she did. David had never read them, had never asked to see them, had never shown any curiosity about the specific nature of her work beyond its general profitability. "There's more," Emma said, extracting another folder. "I've been invited to present my research on cross-cultural business analysis at the International Commerce Conference in Washington next month." The invitation came through the State Department's Office of International Business Relations. She handed Michael a copy of the invitation, knowing he'd appreciate the significance even if Officer Williams didn't immediately grasp it. The International Commerce Conference was attended by senior government officials, multinational corporation executives, and policymakers who shaped global business regulations. Being invited to present research wasn't just professional recognition. It was acknowledgement that her work influenced policy decisions at the highest levels. Michael whistled softly as he read the invitation details. "Emma, this is the keynote panel on emerging markets analysis. Do you realize that the Secretary of Commerce is scheduled to attend this session?" Officer Williams looked up sharply. "The Secretary of Commerce, Ms. Tolan, Chen, you're presenting research to cabinet-level officials? The research focuses on how cultural misunderstandings create trade barriers and how targeted analysis can facilitate more effective international business relationships," Emma explained. "It's based on case studies from my consulting work, including several projects that helped resolve disputes between American companies and European regulatory agencies." What she didn't mention, but what Michael clearly understood from his expression, was that this level of government attention meant Emma's work had implications beyond individual corporate success. Her analysis influenced how American businesses approached international expansion, which affected trade relationships, economic policy, and diplomatic relations between countries. David had never asked about any of this. In his mind, Emma's work was a collection of meetings and reports that generated decent income, while he focused on the important business of climbing his corporate ladder. He'd never understood that while he was managing one company's operations in one city, Emma was analyzing systemic patterns that affected how American businesses operated globally. "Ms. Chen," Officer Williams said slowly, "I'm beginning to understand that your professional profile might support not just individual immigration but potentially expedited processing based on your contributions to American economic interests." Emma felt her breath catch. Expedited processing meant approval within weeks rather than months or years. It meant recognition that her skills and connections represented genuine value to American interests, value that justified prioritizing her application over thousands of others waiting in the standard immigration queue. "There's something else," Michael said, and his tone had shifted into the careful diplomatic language he used when dealing with sensitive information. "Emma, I think Officer Williams should know about the Whitman Industries situation." Emma hesitated. The Whitman Industries consulting project was confidential, bound by non-disclosure agreements that prevented her from discussing details with anyone outside the immediate project team. But Michael's suggestion implied that the project's significance might override standard confidentiality concerns, especially in the context of an immigration interview that was evaluating her professional qualifications. "Officer Williams," Emma said carefully, "6 months ago, my firm was contracted to analyze a regulatory compliance crisis involving a major American manufacturing company's European operations. Without violating confidentiality agreements, I can tell you that our analysis prevented a situation that could have resulted in significant trade complications between the United States and the European Union. Michael nodded encouragingly. Emma's intervention helped resolve a dispute that could have affected thousands of American jobs and millions of dollars in international trade relationships. The resolution required expertise in both American business law and European regulatory frameworks, expertise that very few consultants possess. Officer Williams was writing notes rapidly now, clearly understanding that she was documenting qualifications that went far beyond typical immigration applications. Emma's work wasn't just professionally successful, it was strategically valuable to American economic and diplomatic interests. Ms. Chen, do you have documentation of this project's impact? Emma opened her briefcase and extracted a letter she'd never expected to use for immigration purposes. The letter was from the U.S. Trade Representative's office, thanking her firm for consulting services that had, quote, materially contributed to the successful resolution of trade disputes affecting American manufacturing interests in European markets. The letter was deliberately vague about specifics, but its implications were clear to anyone who understood governmental language. Emma's work had helped prevent a trade crisis that could have damaged American economic relationships with key European allies. Officer Williams read the letter twice, then looked at Michael with an expression that mixed surprise with professional curiosity. Mr. Rodriguez, in your experience, how common is it for private consultants to receive acknowledgement from the Trade Representative's office? Extremely uncommon, Michael replied. This level of recognition typically indicates work that has direct impact on American policy objectives and international relationships. Emma could see Officer Williams processing the cumulative weight of evidence that painted a very different picture of her qualifications than a standard spousal visa application would have revealed. Instead of appearing as a dependent spouse following her husband's career opportunities, Emma was emerging as a professional whose expertise was valued by multiple levels of American government and whose work contributed directly to American economic success abroad. Her phone buzzed with another text from David, but she ignored it. Whatever panic or manipulation he was attempting to deploy through text messages was irrelevant now. The conversation in this interview room had moved far beyond David's understanding or control. Ms. Chen, Officer Williams said, I want to ensure I understand the scope of your professional qualifications correctly. You've been providing consulting services that have been recognized by the Embassy, the State Department, and the Trade Representative's office. Your research is being presented to cabinet-level officials. Your work has contributed to resolving international trade disputes. Is that an accurate summary? That's accurate, Emma confirmed. Though I should add that my consulting firm has also been retained by 3 American companies that are planning major European expansions over the next 2 years. Those projects would benefit significantly from my continued presence in American markets, where I could provide more direct interface between European operations and American corporate headquarters. Michael smiled at her strategic addition of forward-looking professional value. Emma wasn't just documenting past achievements, she was demonstrating ongoing contributions to American business interests that would be enhanced by her presence in the United States. Officer Williams, Michael said, I think you should also know that Emma's presentation at the International Commerce Conference has already generated interest from several government agencies that are considering expanded consulting contracts with her firm. Emma looked at Michael with surprise. She hadn't known about additional government interest, though it made sense that her research would attract attention from agencies responsible for facilitating American business success abroad. Which agencies? Officer Williams asked. I can't discuss specifics without clearance, Michael replied diplomatically, but I can say that Emma's expertise in cross-cultural business analysis is increasingly recognized as essential to American companies' success in global markets. The economic value of that expertise to American interests is substantial and measurable. Officer Williams was clearly impressed, but Emma could see her calculating the implications of approving an individual immigration application that carried this level of governmental support. Immigration officers were accustomed to evaluating standard professional qualifications, medical degrees, engineering expertise, academic achievements. They were less accustomed to evaluating consultants whose work influenced international policy and economic relationships. Ms. Chen, I need to ask a direct question about your marriage, Officer Williams said. Given your professional qualifications and the level of recognition your work has received from American government agencies, what role has your husband played in supporting your career development? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Ms. Chen, I think we need to discuss the process for converting your application from spousal to individual professional immigration, Officer Williams said. Based on the documentation you've provided and Mr. Rodriguez's insights into your government consulting work, I believe you would qualify for expedited processing under the exceptional ability provisions. Emma felt a surge of excitement, mixed with something that might have been vindication. Exceptional ability provisions were reserved for applicants whose professional expertise was considered unusually valuable to American interests. It was recognition that her work contributed meaningfully to American economic success and international relationships. Her phone buzzed again with another text from David, and this time she glanced at it. Emma, whatever you think you're doing, stop it now. We can fix this. Don't make decisions you'll regret. She showed the text to Officer Williams, who read it with an expression of professional distaste. Ms. Chen, does your husband frequently attempt to control your professional decisions through intimidation or pressure? Emma looked at the text message and realized that David's words perfectly illustrated the dynamic that had characterized their entire marriage. He'd never supported her professional growth, but he'd consistently attempted to control her professional choices whenever they conflicted with his preferences or convenience. Yes, she said firmly, he does. Officer Williams made another note, then looked at Emma with an expression that had shifted from routine processing to genuine advocacy. Ms. Chen, I'm going to recommend that we expedite your individual immigration application and that we document your husband's abandonment of the spousal interview as evidence that the marriage doesn't meet the mutual support standards required for spousal immigration. Your professional qualifications are exceptional, and your potential contributions to American economic interests justify prioritized processing. Emma felt tears of relief sting her eyes. After 3 years of marriage to someone who'd consistently minimized her professional value, sitting in a government office while officials discussed her exceptional qualifications felt like stepping into sunlight after years in shadow. Thank you, Officer Williams. I accept your recommendation enthusiastically. Michael smiled at her with unmistakable pride. Emma, I think you're about to discover that America has been waiting for someone with exactly your expertise. Her phone rang with David's ringtone, but she declined the call without hesitation. Whatever David Morrison wanted to say about her decisions, she was no longer interested in hearing it. She'd spent 3 years listening to his assessments of her career, her value, and her potential. Today, she'd heard very different assessments from people whose opinions actually mattered. Officer Williams was preparing paperwork for Emma's revised application when her phone buzzed with a text that made her pause. Emma, you have no idea what you're throwing away. And you have no idea what I'm capable of when someone tries to make me look foolish. She handed the phone to Michael, who read the message with an expression that shifted from concern to something much colder. Emma, he said quietly, I think we need to talk about your husband's business activities. Because if he's threatening you over an immigration decision, there might be other issues we should discuss. Officer Williams looked up from her paperwork. Mr. Rodriguez, are you suggesting there might be additional factors relevant to this case? Michael met Emma's eyes with an expression that was both protective and calculating. I'm suggesting that Emma might have more information about her husband's professional activities than she's shared so far. Information that could be relevant to both her immigration case and potentially other government interests. Emma felt her pulse quicken as she realized that Michael was offering her an opportunity to reveal everything she'd been keeping quiet about David's business practices. The questionable client relationships, the regulatory shortcuts, the financial arrangements that had always made her uncomfortable but that she'd never felt positioned to challenge. David Morrison had just threatened her for pursuing her own professional opportunities, but he had no idea that his wife had been documenting his questionable business practices for months, or that she was sitting in a room with government officials who had the authority to investigate everything he'd been so careful to hide. The tables weren't just turning, they were about to flip completely. Emma had first noticed the irregularities in David's business dealings 6 months ago, not through any deliberate investigation, but through the kind of accidental discovery that comes from sharing financial accounts with someone who assumes you're not paying attention. David had always handled the majority of their finances, claiming his corporate experience made him better qualified to manage investments and tax planning. Emma had been content with this arrangement until the morning she'd logged into their joint account to transfer money for a consulting project expense and found a deposit that didn't match any income source she knew about. $58,000 had appeared in their account with a notation that simply read, "Meridian Consulting Project Completion Bonus." Emma had stared at the screen for several minutes, trying to remember any mention of Meridian Consulting or any project completion that would justify such a substantial bonus. David's regular salary was deposited bi-weekly with clockwork precision, but this payment had come on a Tuesday, from a company she'd never heard of, in an amount that exceeded his monthly salary. When she'd asked David about it that evening, his explanation had been smooth and dismissive. Meridian Consulting was a subsidiary of his company that handled special projects for European clients. The bonus was compensation for work he'd done facilitating a complex international transaction. It was all perfectly legitimate, just corporate structure that was too boring and complicated to explain in detail. But Emma understood corporate structures and international transactions better than David realized. Her consulting work required intimate knowledge of how American companies organized their European operations, and Meridian Consulting didn't fit the patterns she knew. More troubling was David's assumption that she wouldn't understand the complexities of international business structure, when her own work involved analyzing exactly those complexities for government and corporate clients. That night, while David slept beside her, Emma had used her professional databases to research Meridian Consulting. What she found was a shell company registered in Delaware with no operational history, no website, no public record of business activities beyond its legal incorporation. The company existed on paper but had no digital footprint, no staff listings, no client testimonials or project descriptions. For a consulting company that allegedly facilitated complex international transactions, Meridian Consulting was remarkably invisible. Over the following weeks, Emma began paying closer attention to David's financial activities, not from suspicion initially, but from professional curiosity about business structures she didn't recognize. Her consulting work had taught her to identify patterns, and the patterns in David's income were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Additional payments from Meridian Consulting appeared monthly, always at amounts between $40,000 and $70,000, always with vague notations about project completion or consulting fees. Marcus Webb was David's colleague at his primary employer, a smooth-talking account manager who specialized in European regulatory compliance. James Carter was an independent consultant who David claimed provided strategic advice on international business development. Robert Lynch was a lawyer who allegedly helped American companies navigate European legal requirements. But the email chain revealed these men as something very different from David's professional descriptions. They were discussing financial arrangements that had nothing to do with legitimate consulting or regulatory compliance, and everything to do with exploiting loopholes in international financial reporting requirements. Marcus was coordinating transactions that moved money between American and European accounts in ways designed to obscure the actual source and destination of funds. James was providing documentation that made personal payments appear to be legitimate business expenses, allowing David and others to receive substantial income without proper tax reporting. Robert was structuring legal agreements that created artificial business relationships, generating paper trails that justified financial transfers while concealing their actual purpose. Most disturbing was the casual way the email chain referred to Emma's consulting business as a useful cover for their activities. David had been telling his associates that his wife's legitimate government consulting work provided credibility and access that made their financial schemes appear more legitimate to regulatory oversight. Emma's stomach had turned as she realized that David had been exploiting her professional reputation and government relationships to facilitate activities that could potentially violate multiple federal regulations. Her legitimate consulting work was being used as camouflage for a network of financial transactions that she didn't understand, but that clearly operated outside normal business transparency. She'd photographed the email chain with her phone, then closed the laptop and continued her day as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Emma Chen, who built her career on helping companies maintain regulatory compliance and ethical business practices, was married to someone who was systematically violating the principles she helped other people uphold. Over the following months, Emma had conducted her own investigation with the same methodical thoroughness she applied to her professional consulting work. She documented David's financial patterns, researched the companies he was connected to, and gradually assembled a picture of activities that appeared designed to circumvent both tax obligations and regulatory oversight. The Meridian consulting payments were structured to avoid triggering automatic reporting requirements that would alert tax authorities to unusual income patterns. The amounts varied just enough to stay below thresholds that required additional documentation, but were consistent enough to provide David with substantial unreported income. The outgoing payments to various consulting and advisory companies were creating artificial business expenses that offset David's legitimate income for tax purposes, while funding a network of associates who provided services that had nothing to do with David's official corporate responsibilities. Most sophisticated was the way David and his associates had structured their arrangements to exploit differences between American and European financial reporting requirements. Transactions that appeared legitimate under American regulations were structured to avoid European oversight, while activities that satisfied European reporting requirements were designed to circumvent American tax obligations. Emma recognized the pattern because she'd helped several legitimate companies identify and correct similar structural problems in their international operations. But David's network was deliberately creating these problems rather than solving them, using the complexity of international regulations to hide financial activities from both American and European authorities. The breakthrough in Emma's understanding came when she realized that David's network wasn't just exploiting regulatory complexity for personal financial gain. They were potentially facilitating similar arrangements for their corporate clients, creating a service that helped American companies operating in Europe reduce their tax obligations and regulatory compliance requirements through financial structures that operated in gray areas of international law. David's legitimate position managing European accounts for his American employer provided him with intimate knowledge of how multinational companies structured their international operations. He was using that knowledge to create parallel financial arrangements that benefited his network, while potentially exposing his employer to regulatory scrutiny they didn't know about. Emma's professional horror at this realization was compounded by her personal vulnerability. As David's wife, she was potentially liable for financial activities conducted through their joint accounts. As a consultant who worked with government agencies, she was professionally vulnerable to any association with regulatory violations. David had created a situation where his illegal activities could destroy her legitimate career and potentially expose her to criminal liability. Her investigation intensified when she realized that David's associates were discussing expansion of their network to include other corporate employees with access to international financial information. Marcus Webb was recruiting additional participants from his company's European operations. James Carter was developing standardized documentation that would allow the network to offer their services to a broader range of corporate clients. Robert Lynch was researching legal structures that would provide additional protection for network participants while expanding their capacity to facilitate questionable financial arrangements. Emma documented everything. She photographed emails when David left his devices accessible. She researched the financial and legal history of every company and individual connected to David's network. She analyzed transaction patterns using the same analytical tools she applied to her legitimate consulting work. She built a comprehensive picture of activities that appeared to constitute organized financial fraud with potential international implications. The most damning evidence came when Emma discovered that David's network was actively soliciting corporate employees who had access to confidential financial information about their employer's international operations. They were offering substantial compensation for information that would allow them to anticipate and exploit regulatory changes before they were implemented, giving their network advance warning about compliance requirements that could affect the profitability of their financial schemes. This crossed the line from tax avoidance into corporate espionage and potentially insider trading. David and his associates were building a network that could influence international business transactions through information that wasn't available to legitimate market participants. Emma realized that David's abandonment of their immigration interview wasn't just personal betrayal. It was potentially connected to his concern about increased scrutiny that might come with formal government review of their relationship and financial arrangements. David might have calculated that abandoning Emma was safer than risking detailed examination of their joint financial activities by immigration officials who had authority to investigate potential fraud. The most chilling discovery was evidence that David's network had contingency plans for dealing with investigation or exposure. They had discussed strategies for shifting liability to network participants' spouses, using marriage relationships to claim that financial activities were conducted without the knowledge or consent of the actual perpetrators. Emma found email discussions about using wives' legitimate business activities as cover for network operations, then claiming that the wives had conducted unauthorized transactions if the network came under scrutiny. David and his associates had deliberately structured their arrangements to make their spouses vulnerable to criminal liability while protecting themselves through plausible deniability. David hadn't just been exploiting Emma's professional reputation to make his financial schemes appear legitimate. He'd been positioning her to take responsibility for those schemes if they were discovered. Her legitimate consulting work and government relationships weren't just camouflage for his activities. They were intended to make her the primary target of any investigation, while allowing David to claim ignorance of activities conducted through their joint accounts. Sitting in the embassy interview room with Officer Williams and Michael Rodriguez, Emma realized that David's threatening text messages weren't just angry responses to her immigration decisions. They were attempts to intimidate her into silence about activities that could expose his entire network to criminal investigation. But David had made a fundamental miscalculation about his wife's capabilities and connections. Emma didn't just understand his financial schemes. She documented them with the same professional thoroughness that made her consulting work valuable to government agencies. She had evidence that could expose not just David's tax avoidance, but a network of corporate employees who were potentially violating federal regulations and international financial reporting requirements. More importantly, she was sitting in a room with officials who had the authority and expertise to understand the significance of what she'd discovered. Michael Rodriguez's diplomatic position gave him access to information about international financial crime that would help him assess the broader implications of David's network. Officer Williams' immigration authority included responsibility for investigating marriage fraud and financial irregularities that might affect visa applications. Emma's investigation hadn't just revealed her husband's criminal activities. It had positioned her to expose those activities to officials who could take meaningful action while protecting her from the liability David had tried to create. David Morrison thought he'd abandoned a helpless wife at an immigration interview. Instead, he'd isolated himself from the one person who'd been protecting him from exposure, and he'd done it in front of government officials who were about to learn exactly what kind of man they were dealing with. Emma looked at Officer Williams and Michael Rodriguez, then made a decision that would change everything for everyone involved in David's network. Officer Williams, Mr. Rodriguez, I think there are some additional factors you should know about my husband's business activities. Factors that might be relevant to both my immigration case and broader regulatory enforcement concerns. She opened her briefcase and extracted the folder she'd compiled over 6 months of careful investigation. The folder that contained evidence of financial fraud, corporate espionage, and international regulatory violations that could destroy multiple careers and potentially result in criminal prosecution. I believe my husband has been using our marriage and my professional reputation to facilitate activities that violate federal financial regulations, and I have documentation that proves it. Michael's expression shifted into the focused intensity he used when dealing with matters that had serious governmental implications. Officer Williams set down her pen and gave Emma her complete attention. Emma was about to transform from abandoned wife to key witness in a case that would reach far beyond her immigration status. David Morrison had thought he was controlling their narrative, but he was about to discover that his wife had been writing a very different story all along. The folder Emma placed on Officer Williams' desk contained 6 months of methodical documentation that would have impressed any federal investigator. Each page was organized with the same analytical precision Emma applied to her professional consulting work. But instead of helping companies maintain regulatory compliance, She'd been documenting how her husband systematically violated it. Officer Williams, what I'm about to show you represents potential violations of the Bank Secrecy Act, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and multiple IRS reporting requirements, Emma said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. My husband has been operating a financial network that exploits international regulatory gaps to hide income and facilitate tax evasion for corporate clients. Michael leaned forward, his diplomatic training immediately recognizing the serious governmental implications of Emma's statement. Emma, before you continue, I need to ensure you understand that once you share this information with federal officials, it will trigger mandatory reporting requirements. Are you prepared for that level of governmental involvement? Emma met his eyes with a calm determination that surprised her. 6 months ago, she would have been terrified at the thought of exposing David to federal investigation. Now, after being abandoned at the most crucial moment of their immigration interview, she felt only relief at finally being able to reveal the truth she'd been carrying alone. I'm not just prepared for governmental involvement, Michael. I'm requesting it. David has been using my consulting business and government relationships as cover for criminal activities, and I want protection from the legal liability he's tried to create for me. Officer Williams was studying the first page of Emma's documentation, which laid out the basic structure of David's financial network with the clarity of a professional intelligence briefing. Emma had learned to present complex information to government officials through her consulting work, and those skills served her well as she began dismantling her husband's criminal enterprise. This timeline shows irregular income deposits to our joint accounts over the past 8 months, Emma explained, pointing to a spreadsheet that tracked every suspicious transaction. David receives monthly payments from Meridian Consulting, a shell company with no operational history or legitimate business activities. The amounts vary between $40,000 and $70,000, structured to avoid automatic reporting thresholds. Michael whistled softly as he reviewed the financial data. Emma, these payment amounts are sophisticated. Someone with detailed knowledge of banking regulations designed this structure specifically to evade detection. That someone is Robert Lynch, a lawyer who specializes in international financial compliance, Emma said, turning to the next section of her documentation. Lynch has been creating legal structures that allow David's network to move money between American and European accounts while minimizing oversight from both regulatory systems. Officer Williams was taking notes rapidly, clearly understanding that Emma's evidence represented more than marriage problems or immigration complications. Ms. Chen, how did you obtain this financial information? David conducted these transactions through our joint accounts, using my legitimate business relationships as credibility for activities I knew nothing about, Emma replied. I discovered the irregularities when I was managing our finances for my own consulting expenses. Everything I'm showing you was accessible to me as his spouse and joint account holder. Emma turned to a section of her folder that made Michael's expression darken considerably. This correspondence shows that David and his associates have been soliciting confidential information from corporate employees about their company's international operations. They're paying for advance notice about regulatory changes that could affect their financial schemes. The emails Emma had photographed revealed a network that went far beyond simple tax avoidance. David's associate Marcus Webb had been recruiting employees from multiple American companies operating in Europe, offering substantial compensation for information about upcoming compliance requirements, regulatory audits, and policy changes that weren't yet public knowledge. This constitutes corporate espionage, Officer Williams said grimly. These men are building a network that could manipulate international business transactions through insider information. There's more, Emma said, her voice growing stronger as she revealed each layer of David's deception. They've been discussing expansion into what they call free clients. They're planning to offer services that help American companies reduce their tax obligations and compliance requirements through financial structures that operate in gray areas of international law. Michael was studying correspondence that revealed the true scope of David's ambitions. Emma, this isn't just personal financial fraud. If they're successful, they could be facilitating tax avoidance and regulatory violations for dozens of American companies operating internationally. Emma nodded, feeling a grim satisfaction at seeing government officials recognize the significance of what she'd uncovered. David's legitimate position managing European accounts gives him access to confidential information about multinational corporate structures. He's been using that knowledge to create parallel financial arrangements that benefit his network while potentially exposing his employer to regulatory scrutiny they don't know about. The next section of Emma's documentation revealed the aspect of David's activities that had convinced her to expose everything to federal authorities. David and his associates had developed contingency plans for deflecting investigation by shifting liability to their spouses. Officer Williams, this email chain discusses strategies for using wives' legitimate business activities as cover for network operations, then claiming that the wives conducted unauthorized transactions if the network comes under scrutiny. Emma said, her voice tight with controlled anger. David deliberately structured these arrangements to make me vulnerable to criminal liability, while protecting himself through plausible deniability. Michael's expression had shifted into the cold professionalism he used when dealing with serious threats to American interests. Emma, they were planning to make you responsible for David's crimes? They were planning to use my consulting work and government relationships to make their financial schemes appear legitimate, then claim I had exceeded my authority and conducted unauthorized activities if anyone investigated, Emma confirmed. My legitimate professional reputation wasn't just camouflage for David's activities. It was intended to make me the primary target of any investigation. Officer Williams was reading the email evidence with visible disgust. Ms. Chen, this level of calculated manipulation suggests that your husband's abandonment of today's interview might have been strategic rather than impulsive. He might have decided that avoiding detailed governmental review of your relationship was worth sacrificing your immigration status. Emma felt pieces clicking into place, as Officer Williams articulated what she'd been suspecting but hadn't wanted to admit. David's abandonment hadn't been about work emergencies or lack of commitment. It had been about avoiding the kind of detailed financial scrutiny that immigration interviews sometimes triggered, especially when they involve professional couples with complex international business relationships. There's something else, Emma said, turning to the final section of her documentation. David's network has been particularly interested in my consulting work with embassy cultural programs and State Department initiatives. They've been discussing ways to exploit my government relationships for information about policy changes that could affect international business regulations. Michael's face went very still as he processed the implications of Emma's revelation. Emma, are you saying that David tried to use your consulting work to gain unauthorized access to governmental policy information? I'm saying that David and his associates have been treating my government consulting contracts as intelligence sources for their financial schemes, Emma replied. They've been asking me questions about regulatory trends, policy developments, and governmental priorities that they claim are for David's legitimate corporate work, but that I now realize were intended to give their network advance warning about changes that could affect their operations. The room fell silent as Officer Williams and Michael absorbed the full scope of what Emma had revealed. David Morrison wasn't just a husband who'd abandoned his wife at an immigration interview. He was the central figure in a criminal network that had attempted to exploit government relationships, manipulate corporate information, and facilitate international financial fraud. Emma's phone buzzed with another message from David, and this time she handed it immediately to Officer Williams. Emma, I know you're upset, but whatever you think you're accomplishing with this embassy drama isn't going to work. You need to remember that your name is on everything we've built together. Think carefully about your next decisions. Officer Williams read the message aloud, her voice heavy with professional disapproval. Ms. Chen, this appears to be an attempt to intimidate you using the very financial liability that you've just documented was deliberately created to control you. Michael was already reaching for his phone. Officer Williams, I think we need to involve additional embassy security and possibly coordinate with federal law enforcement. Emma's evidence suggests criminal activities that have implications beyond immigration services. Emma felt a surge of validation as she watched government officials take her revelations seriously and begin coordinating appropriate responses. For months, she'd been carrying the weight of David's criminal activities alone, uncertain whether anyone would believe her or take action on her evidence. Now she was watching federal officials recognize the seriousness of what she'd uncovered and begin mobilizing resources to address it. Mr. Rodriguez, I agree that this requires coordination with federal law enforcement, Officer Williams said. Ms. Chen, I want to ensure you understand that your cooperation with this investigation will be documented as part of your immigration file. Your willingness to expose criminal activities that you could have remained silent about demonstrates exactly the kind of character and commitment to American legal principles that immigration law is designed to recognize. Emma felt tears of relief threaten as Officer Williams articulated what she'd hoped but hadn't dared expect. Her decision to expose David's crimes wasn't just protecting her from legal liability, it was actually strengthening her immigration case by demonstrating her commitment to American legal and ethical standards. Officer Williams, I want to cooperate fully with any investigation. I also want to ensure that my consulting clients, particularly government agencies, are protected from any compromise that David's network might have attempted through my relationships. Michael nodded approvingly. Emma, I'll coordinate with embassy security to review your government contracts and ensure that no classified or sensitive information has been accessed inappropriately. Your cooperation in identifying potential security breaches will be valuable to multiple agencies. Officer Williams was organizing Emma's documentation into categories that would facilitate federal investigation. Ms. Chen, this evidence is comprehensive enough to support multiple criminal charges against several individuals. Bank fraud, tax evasion, corporate espionage, and potentially conspiracy charges for the network as a whole. Emma's phone rang with David's ringtone, and Officer Williams nodded for her to answer on speaker. Emma, where are you? I've been waiting at the embassy parking garage for an hour. We need to talk about this ridiculous immigration situation before you make it worse. David's voice carried the irritated confidence of someone who assumed he was still controlling the situation. David, I'm still in the embassy, in an ongoing interview with Officer Williams and Mr. Rodriguez, Emma replied calmly. There was a pause, and when David spoke again, his tone had shifted to concern mixed with irritation. Emma, what's taking so long? The interview should have been finished hours ago. What are you discussing? We're discussing your business activities, David. Specifically, your financial network and the ways you've been using our marriage and my professional relationships to facilitate activities that appear to violate federal regulations. The silence that followed was long enough that Emma thought the call might have dropped. Then David's voice came back, and all the smooth corporate polish was gone, replaced by something much sharper and more dangerous. Emma, I don't know what you think you're accomplishing, but you need to stop talking immediately. You're in way over your head, and you're about to create problems that will destroy both of us. Officer Williams leaned toward the phone. Mr. Morrison, this is Officer Patricia Williams, Immigration Services. I need to inform you that your wife is providing voluntary cooperation with a federal investigation into potential financial crimes. Any attempts to intimidate or threaten her will be documented as obstruction of justice. Another long silence, then David's voice, tight, with barely controlled panic. Federal investigation? Emma, what have you done? What have you told them? I've told them the truth, David. About Meridian Consulting, about your network's financial schemes, about the ways you've been exploiting my government relationships, and about your plans to make me liable for your criminal activities. Emma, you don't understand what you're dealing with. These aren't just my activities. There are other people involved, important people who won't appreciate being exposed. You need to think about your safety. Michael's expression had gone very cold at David's implied threat. Mr. Morrison, are you threatening your wife's safety if she continues cooperating with federal authorities? I'm not threatening anyone, David said quickly, clearly realizing he'd revealed more than he intended. I'm simply pointing out that Emma doesn't understand the full scope of what she's gotten involved in. Mr. Morrison, I think Emma understands the scope quite well, Officer Williams replied. She's provided extensive documentation of your network's activities, including evidence that you deliberately structured financial arrangements to make her vulnerable to criminal liability while protecting yourself. David's voice, when it came back, was smaller, more desperate. Emma, please, we can work this out privately. You don't need to involve federal authorities in our personal problems. David, these aren't personal problems. These are federal crimes that you committed using our joint resources and my professional reputation, Emma said firmly. And I'm not going to be held responsible for activities I never agreed to and never benefited from. Emma, I'm coming back into the embassy. We need to discuss this face-to-face. Mr. Morrison, Michael interjected. I'm afraid that won't be possible. Embassy security has been notified about this situation. and you won't be permitted access to immigration services areas while this investigation is ongoing. Investigation? What investigation? Emma, what exactly have you accused me of? Emma looked at Officer Williams and Michael, both of whom nodded encouragingly. David, I've provided evidence of financial fraud, tax evasion, corporate espionage, and conspiracy to exploit government relationships for unauthorized purposes. I've also documented your network's plans to shift criminal liability to participants' spouses. The line went quiet except for the sound of David's breathing. When he spoke again, his voice carried a cold fury that Emma had never heard before. Emma, you have just made the biggest mistake of your life. You think these government friends of yours are going to protect you? You think exposing me makes you safe? You have no idea what you've set in motion. Officer Williams was writing notes rapidly, documenting David's increasingly threatening responses. Mr. Morrison, I'm required to inform you that threats against witnesses cooperating with federal investigations constitute additional federal crimes. I'm not making threats. I'm simply explaining reality to my naive wife who thinks she understands business relationships that are far more complex than her little consulting projects. Michael leaned toward the phone, his diplomatic authority evident in his tone. Mr. Morrison, I think you should understand that Emma's consulting work has been reviewed and valued by multiple federal agencies. Her professional judgment and ethical standards are well established, which is why her evidence against your network is being taken very seriously. David's laugh was bitter and sharp. Professional judgment? Emma's been a useful cover for sophisticated business operations that generated substantial income for both of us. She benefited from every dollar that came through our accounts, regardless of its source. David, Emma said quietly, I never agreed to benefit from criminal activities, and I've been documenting evidence that will protect me from the liability you tried to create. Your financial schemes were conducted without my knowledge or consent, using my reputation as camouflage while positioning me to take responsibility if you were discovered. These are federal crimes that you committed using our joint resources and my professional reputation, Emma said firmly. And I'm not going to be held responsible for activities I never agreed to and never benefited from. Emma, I'm coming back into the embassy. We need to discuss this face-to-face. Mr. Morrison, Michael interjected. I'm afraid that won't be possible. Embassy security has been notified about this situation, and you won't be permitted access to immigration services areas while this investigation is ongoing. Investigation? What investigation? Emma, what exactly have you accused me of? Emma looked at Officer Williams and Michael, both of whom nodded encouragingly. David, I've provided evidence of financial fraud, tax evasion, corporate espionage, and conspiracy to exploit government relationships for unauthorized purposes. I've also documented your network's plans to shift criminal liability to participants' spouses. The line went quiet except for the sound of David's breathing. When he spoke again, his voice carried a cold fury that Emma had never heard before. Emma, you have just made the biggest mistake of your life. You think these government friends of yours are going to protect you? You think exposing me makes you safe? You have no idea what you've set in motion. Officer Williams was writing notes rapidly, documenting David's increasingly threatening responses. Mr. Morrison, I'm required to inform you that threats against witnesses cooperating with federal investigations constitute additional federal crimes. I'm not making threats. I'm simply explaining reality to my naive wife who thinks she understands business relationships that are far more complex than her little consulting projects. Michael leaned toward the phone, his diplomatic authority evident in his tone. Mr. Morrison, I think you should understand that Emma's consulting work has been reviewed and valued by multiple federal agencies. Her professional judgment and ethical standards are well established, which is why her evidence against your network is being taken very seriously. David's laugh was bitter and sharp. Professional judgment? Emma's been a useful cover for sophisticated business operations that generated substantial income for both of us. She benefited from every dollar that came through our accounts, regardless of its source. David, Emma said quietly, I never agreed to benefit from criminal activities, and I've been documenting evidence that will protect me from the liability you tried to create. Your financial schemes were conducted without my knowledge or consent, using my reputation as camouflage while positioning me to take responsibility if you were discovered. Emma, you signed joint tax returns. Your name is on every account. You're as liable as anyone else involved in these arrangements. Officer Williams looked up from her notes. Mr. Morrison, your wife has provided extensive evidence that she was deliberately excluded from knowledge about the source and nature of irregular income while being positioned to appear responsible for activities she didn't authorize. That evidence supports her claims of manipulation rather than willing participation. Emma could hear David breathing hard through the phone, clearly realizing that his attempts to intimidate her were being systematically countered by federal officials who understood both the legal implications and the personal dynamics involved. This conversation is being recorded for federal investigation purposes. Officer Williams added, Mr. Morrison, I'd recommend that you consult with legal counsel before making any additional statements. The call ended abruptly, leaving Emma sitting in silence with two government officials who had just witnessed her husband threaten her for exposing his criminal activities. Emma, Michael said gently, I think you should know that you've just demonstrated exactly the kind of courage and integrity that America needs in its newest citizens. You could have remained silent about activities that didn't directly harm you, but you chose to expose criminal behavior that threatened American business interests and governmental security. Officer Williams nodded in agreement. Ms. Chen, your cooperation with this investigation, combined with your professional qualifications and demonstrated commitment to American legal principles, supports not just individual immigration approval, but expedited processing as someone whose presence serves American interests. Emma felt a weight lifting from her shoulders that she'd been carrying for months without realizing it. David Morrison had thought he could manipulate her into being complicit in his crimes, then abandon her when her presence became inconvenient. Instead, he'd isolated himself from the one person who could have protected him, and he'd done it in front of federal officials who now had comprehensive evidence of his criminal network. Her phone buzzed with a text message. But this time, it wasn't from David. It was from Marcus Webb, David's associate, and the message was brief. Emma, David says you're talking to federal investigators. You need to understand that your consulting business has been part of our network's operations. Whether you knew it or not, think carefully about your next moves. Emma handed the phone to Officer Williams, who read the message and smiled grimly. Miss Chen, I think Mr. Webb just provided additional evidence of conspiracy and witness intimidation. Your husband's associates are making our investigation much easier by documenting their own criminal intent. Emma realized that David's network was beginning to panic, and panicked criminals made mistakes that federal investigators could exploit. Her decision to expose David's activities hadn't just protected her from legal liability, it had triggered the collapse of an entire criminal enterprise. David Morrison had abandoned his wife at an immigration interview, thinking he was protecting himself from inconvenient scrutiny. Instead, he'd created the conditions for his own destruction, and he'd done it with an audience of federal officials who had the authority to ensure that justice was served. 3 weeks after that life-changing afternoon in the embassy interview room, Emma Chen stood in her new apartment in downtown Washington, D.C., watching the sunrise through floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Potomac River. The space was completely hers, furnished with pieces she'd chosen herself, decorated in colors that made her feel calm rather than impressed. For the first time in years, her living space reflected her actual preferences, rather than David's vision of what their image required. The apartment itself was a study in understated elegance that spoke to Emma's authentic taste rather than performative luxury. Clean lines, natural materials, and carefully chosen artwork created an environment that felt both professional and deeply personal. The walls displayed her consulting certifications alongside photographs from her international projects, creating a visual narrative of her professional journey that had nothing to do with anyone else's achievements. Her home office occupied the apartment's eastern corner, where morning light illuminated a workspace designed for serious intellectual work rather than impressive appearances. The desk she'd chosen was substantial, but not ostentatious, crafted from reclaimed wood that spoke to sustainability values David had never shared. Bookcases lined 2 walls, filled with texts on international business law, cross-cultural analysis, and governmental policy that represented her genuine intellectual interests, rather than decorative accessories. The immigration approval had come through in record time, exactly as Officer Williams had predicted. Emma's exceptional ability visa had been expedited not just because of her professional qualifications, but because of her cooperation with what had become a major federal investigation into international financial crime. The State Department's letter of commendation thanking her for her service to American interests now hung framed in her home office next to her consulting licenses and government contracts. The letter itself was more than ceremonial recognition. Signed by the Deputy Secretary of State for Economic Affairs, it specifically acknowledged Emma's exceptional courage in exposing criminal activities that threatened American business interests and her invaluable cooperation with federal law enforcement agencies. The language was formal, but Emma understood its significance in governmental circles. This wasn't routine appreciation for civic duty. This was official recognition that her actions had served important American policy objectives. Michael Rodriguez had been true to his word about Emma's expanded opportunities, though even he had underestimated how significantly her cooperation with federal investigators would enhance her professional prospects. The Commerce Department consulting contract he'd mentioned had materialized into a 3-year agreement that established her as the primary analyst for American companies seeking to expand into European markets, while maintaining full regulatory compliance. The scope of the Commerce Department work exceeded anything Emma had imagined possible when she was married to David. Her official title was Senior International Business Compliance Analyst, a position that came with security clearance, access to confidential policy information, and responsibility for advising both government officials and corporate executives on regulatory matters that affected billions of dollars in international trade. The work involved analyzing regulatory frameworks across multiple countries, identifying potential compliance challenges for American businesses, and developing strategic recommendations that helped companies navigate complex international requirements while maintaining ethical business practices. Emma's recommendations influenced policy decisions at the highest levels of government and affected how American corporations structured their international operations. Her first major project involved developing compliance protocols for American technology companies expanding into European markets post-Brexit. The regulatory landscape had become increasingly complex as British, European Union, and American requirements diverged, creating compliance challenges that required sophisticated analysis of overlapping jurisdictions and competing policy objectives. Emma's analysis had identified 17 specific areas where American companies faced potential regulatory conflicts, along with detailed recommendations for structural changes that would ensure compliance with all relevant requirements. Her report had been circulated to cabinet-level officials and had influenced formal policy guidance issued by multiple federal agencies. But the professional success, satisfying as it was, paled in comparison to the personal liberation of living authentically. Emma woke up each morning knowing that every decision she made served her own goals rather than someone else's manipulation. She chose her work based on its value and her interest rather than whether it would interfere with David's social obligations. She made friends based on genuine connection rather than networking value. She planned her future based on her own dreams rather than someone else's career trajectory. The contrast was most evident in how Emma spent her time outside work. During her marriage to David, evenings and weekends had been structured around his professional obligations and social ambitions. Corporate dinners, networking events, and industry conferences had dominated their calendar, with Emma's role limited to appearing supportive and making conversation that enhanced David's professional image. Now Emma's personal time belonged entirely to her. She'd joined a book club focused on international literature, finding intellectual stimulation in discussions with academics and professionals who shared her interest in cross-cultural understanding. She'd begun taking photography classes, discovering a creative outlet that had nothing to do with professional advancement or social positioning. Her social circle had transformed completely. Instead of David's corporate colleagues and their wives, Emma now spent time with foreign service officers, international lawyers, academic researchers, and policy analysts who were genuinely interested in her expertise and perspectives. These relationships were built on mutual respect and shared intellectual interests rather than social hierarchy or professional utility. The federal investigation that her evidence had triggered had moved with stunning efficiency once FBI financial crimes investigators became involved. David's network of associates had crumbled with remarkable speed when faced with federal prosecution, each man eager to negotiate reduced sentences by providing evidence against the others. The investigation itself had revealed a criminal enterprise far more sophisticated and extensive than even Emma had realized. FBI financial analysts had traced the network's activities across 18 months, involving more than 40 corporate employees at 12 different American companies operating internationally. The total amount of unreported income exceeded $8 million, with tax evasion reaching nearly $3 million in avoided federal obligations. Special Agent Patricia Martinez, who led the FBI's financial crimes investigation, had kept Emma informed about the case's progress both as a matter of professional courtesy and because Emma's continued cooperation was valuable to understanding the full scope of the criminal network's activities. Ms. Chen, what your evidence revealed was just the tip of a very large iceberg, Agent Martinez had explained during one of their regular briefings. Your husband's network had been operating for almost 2 years before you discovered it, and they'd successfully recruited participants from companies representing nearly every major American industry with significant international operations. The sophistication of David's criminal enterprise had impressed even experienced federal investigators. The network had developed standardized procedures for recruiting corporate employees, systematic methods for structuring financial transactions to avoid detection, and comprehensive strategies for deflecting regulatory scrutiny through legal and structural camouflage. They'd essentially created a shadow consulting industry that offered corporate employees opportunities to monetize confidential information about their company's international operations. Agent Martinez continued. Your husband and his associates were providing services that helped participants exploit regulatory gaps while maintaining plausible deniability about the nature of their activities. Marcus Webb had been the first to break, revealing the full scope of the corporate espionage operation and providing detailed testimony about how the network had recruited employees from multiple American companies operating internationally. His cooperation had led to arrests at 6 different corporations and regulatory investigations that were still ongoing. Webb's testimony had revealed that the network operated through what they called regulatory consulting, offering corporate employees substantial compensation for information about upcoming policy changes, regulatory audits, and compliance requirements that weren't yet public knowledge. The information was then used to help network participants and their clients structure financial arrangements that exploited temporary regulatory gaps. Marcus Webb was essentially running corporate espionage operations disguised as legitimate consulting services, Agent Martinez explained. He'd identify employees with access to confidential regulatory information, offer them consulting contracts that seemed legitimate, then use the information they provided to help his network avoid compliance requirements and tax obligations. Webb's cooperation had been particularly valuable because he'd maintained detailed records of the network's activities, apparently as insurance against his associates. His files contained communications, financial records, and strategic planning documents that provided federal investigators with a comprehensive picture of how the criminal enterprise operated. The evidence Webb provided had implicated corporate employees at American companies operating in 15 different countries. Several had been using their legitimate positions to provide confidential information about regulatory changes, compliance audits, and policy developments that gave the network advance warning about governmental actions that could affect their operations. James Carter had attempted to flee to Switzerland but was arrested at Dulles Airport with falsified documents and nearly $2 million in cash. His prosecution had become a high-profile case that made international news when investigators discovered that his network had been facilitating tax evasion for American companies across 12 different countries. Carter's arrest had been particularly dramatic because he'd attempted to board an international flight using a passport with a false identity, carrying cash structured in amounts designed to avoid currency reporting requirements. Airport security had flagged him for additional screening when his behavior suggested nervous deception, leading to the discovery of multiple false documents and evidence of flight from prosecution. James Carter's arrest revealed the international scope of this criminal network, Agent Martinez noted. He'd been maintaining financial accounts in 6 different countries, using legal structures that exploited differences between national regulatory systems to hide income and assets from American tax authorities. Carter's international financial activities had triggered cooperation between American federal investigators and law enforcement agencies in multiple countries. Swiss authorities had frozen accounts containing more than $4 million in assets that Carter had accumulated through his network's activities. British financial regulators had initiated their own investigation into Carter's London-based consulting operations. The international cooperation had revealed that Carter's network wasn't unique. Similar operations were apparently facilitating regulatory avoidance and tax evasion for American corporations operating globally, suggesting a systematic problem that required coordinated governmental response. Robert Lynch had tried to claim legal privilege to avoid cooperating with investigators, but the evidence Emma had provided included communications that demonstrated he was an active participant in the criminal enterprise, rather than merely providing legal advice. His law license had been suspended pending criminal prosecution, and several of his corporate clients were facing their own regulatory investigations. Lynch's case had been complicated by his attempts to claim attorney-client privilege for communications that federal investigators determined were part of criminal conspiracy, rather than legitimate legal consultation. The distinction had required careful legal analysis, but Emma's evidence had included correspondence, where Lynch discussed strategy for concealing criminal activities, rather than providing legal advice about compliance requirements. Robert Lynch's prosecution has been particularly important because it establishes precedent for how attorney-client privilege applies to lawyers who participate directly in criminal enterprises, Agent Martinez explained. His conviction will make it more difficult for future defendants to claim legal privilege as protection for criminal conspiracy. Lynch's professional destruction had been swift and comprehensive. The State Bar Association had initiated disciplinary proceedings that resulted in permanent disbarment, effectively ending his legal career. Professional liability insurance had refused coverage for claims arising from his criminal activities, leaving him personally responsible for defending civil lawsuits from clients who'd been harmed by his actions. But it was David's fate that provided Emma with the most profound sense of justice served. The man who had abandoned her at their immigration interview, thinking he was protecting himself from inconvenient scrutiny, had instead triggered his own complete destruction. The financial crimes charges against David included bank fraud, tax evasion, money laundering, and conspiracy. The corporate espionage charges added violations of the Economic Espionage Act and unauthorized access to confidential business information. The intimidation and threats he'd made against Emma during the investigation had resulted in additional witness tampering charges. David's prosecution had been particularly complex because his criminal activities had been so thoroughly integrated with his legitimate corporate responsibilities. Federal prosecutors had spent months analyzing his professional conduct to distinguish between authorized business activities and criminal exploitation of his corporate position. Your husband's case required sophisticated financial analysis because he'd been very careful to structure his criminal activities to appear consistent with his legitimate corporate responsibilities, Agent Martinez had explained. He'd exploited his authorized access to confidential business information to facilitate unauthorized financial arrangements, making it challenging to prove criminal intent. The breakthrough in David's prosecution had come when investigators analyzed the timing of his financial transactions relative to confidential corporate information he'd accessed through his legitimate employment. The pattern revealed that David had been systematically monetizing advanced knowledge about regulatory changes, policy developments, and compliance requirements that weren't yet public. We were able to demonstrate that David Morrison had received substantial payments within days of accessing confidential information about regulatory changes that affected his network's financial strategies, Agent Martinez continued. The timing was too consistent to be coincidental, and the amounts were too substantial to represent legitimate consulting compensation. David's criminal prosecution had been accompanied by civil proceedings that were, in many ways, more devastating to his long-term prospects than the criminal charges themselves. The IRS had initiated civil proceedings to recover taxes on the unreported income David had received through his network, plus penalties and interest that exceeded the original amounts involved. The IRS civil case had been particularly damaging because it encompassed not just the income David had failed to report, but also fraudulent deductions he'd claimed for business expenses that were actually personal expenditures disguised through his network's financial structures. The total tax liability, including penalties and interest, exceeded $600,000. Civil lawsuits from several of David's former employers were seeking damages for the confidential information he'd exploited for personal gain. These cases were proceeding independently of the criminal prosecution, creating multiple venues where David's professional misconduct was being documented and adjudicated. The most significant civil case involved David's primary employer, which was seeking damages for breach of fiduciary duty, violation of confidentiality agreements, and harm to business relationships caused by David's criminal activities. The company's internal investigation had revealed that David's exploitation of confidential information had potentially compromised competitive advantages worth millions of dollars. David Morrison's civil liability could exceed the value of any assets he's accumulated through legitimate means, Agent Martinez noted. Even if he serves his prison sentence and satisfies his criminal restitution obligations, the civil judgments could affect his financial prospects for decades. Professional licensing boards were reviewing David's credentials for revocation, a process that would permanently end his ability to work in corporate finance or international business consulting. Immigration authorities were evaluating whether his criminal activities affected his own status as an American citizen living abroad, potentially complicating his ability to travel internationally even after completing his sentence. Most devastating for someone who had built his identity around corporate success and social status, David's employer had not just terminated him, but had filed civil charges seeking damages for the breach of fiduciary duty his criminal activities represented. The company's internal investigation had revealed that David had been exploiting his legitimate position to facilitate financial schemes that exposed them to regulatory liability they'd never authorized. The termination process had been deliberately public and humiliating. Corporate security had escorted David from the building during normal business hours, ensuring that colleagues and clients witnessed his dismissal. The company had issued an internal memorandum explaining that David's termination was related to violations of corporate ethics policies and ongoing criminal investigation, effectively ending any possibility of positive professional references. Emma had learned about David's arrest through Michael, who'd called to inform her that federal marshals had taken David into custody at his office building in front of colleagues and clients who'd witnessed the perp walk through the corporate lobby. This scene had been recorded by security cameras and leaked to local business media, ensuring that David's professional reputation was destroyed as publicly as he'd attempted to destroy Emma's immigration status. "Emma, I wanted you to hear this directly from me," Michael had said during that phone call. David Morrison was arrested this morning at his office in Canary Wharf. Federal marshals coordinated with British authorities to execute the arrest warrant during normal business hours, in full view of his colleagues and clients. The timing of the arrest had been strategically chosen to maximize professional humiliation. David had been taken into custody during the middle of a client presentation, interrupting a meeting where he'd been attempting to secure new business that would have provided substantial commission income. The arrest was recorded by building security cameras, and the footage was somehow obtained by financial news media, Michael continued. David's professional reputation in London financial circles has been completely destroyed. No legitimate financial institution will work with someone whose arrest for financial crimes was broadcast on business news programs. The media coverage of David's arrest had been extensive and uniformly damaging. Financial news outlets had reported not just the basic facts of his criminal charges, but detailed analysis of how his network had operated, and what his prosecution meant for corporate compliance requirements at other American companies operating internationally. Professional publications had used David's case as an example of how corporate employees could exploit their positions for personal gain while exposing their employers to regulatory liability. Industry conferences were featuring presentations about the Morrison case as a cautionary example of how inadequate internal controls could facilitate employee fraud. The criminal charges weren't David's only problem. Professional and social consequences had multiplied far beyond what federal prosecution alone could have achieved. The colleagues who'd once sought his advice and company now avoided association with someone under federal investigation for financial crimes. Emma had heard through former mutual acquaintances that David's social exile was complete and devastating. Corporate colleagues who'd once competed for his attention at networking events now refused to acknowledge him in professional settings. Social clubs and professional organizations that had provided his identity and validation had quietly suspended his memberships pending resolution of his criminal case. David's been completely ostracized by the London financial community, Sarah Mitchell, Emma's former neighbor, had mentioned during a chance encounter at a coffee shop near the embassy. I heard from Margaret Walsh that he's been blacklisted from every major corporate event and professional conference. No one wants to be associated with someone under federal investigation for financial crimes. The social consequences had extended beyond professional relationships to personal connections that had seemed more substantial. Country club memberships had been suspended. Charity board positions had been quietly terminated. Invitations to social events that had once filled David's calendar had simply stopped arriving. "It's actually quite sad," Sarah continued. "David built his entire identity around social status and professional recognition, and now he's completely isolated. I heard he's living alone in some terrible flat in East London, unable to afford the lifestyle he maintained through criminal income." But perhaps most fitting was the professional exile that David was experiencing from the corporate and social circles where he'd built his identity. The exclusive professional networks that had provided his social validation had quietly distanced themselves from someone whose reputation was associated with financial crime and betrayal. Emma had received reports through various professional channels that David's employment prospects were essentially non-existent. The financial crimes conviction would permanently bar him from positions requiring security clearance or fiduciary responsibility. Professional licensing restrictions would prevent him from working in consulting, financial services, or international business analysis. David Morrison's professional reputation has been so thoroughly destroyed that he's essentially unemployable in any field related to his previous expertise, Agent Martinez had observed. Financial institutions won't hire convicted felons, consulting firms won't work with someone associated with regulatory violations, and international businesses won't trust someone who's been prosecuted for exploiting confidential corporate information. The registration requirements associated with David's criminal conviction would complicate his ability to travel internationally, effectively ending any possibility of rebuilding his career through overseas opportunities. European immigration authorities had been notified of his criminal prosecution, making it unlikely that he could obtain work authorization in countries where American financial professionals typically found alternative employment. Even more personally devastating was the collapse of David's relationship with Melissa Cartwright, the marketing director who'd been his motivation for abandoning Emma at the immigration interview. Emma had learned through professional gossip that Melissa had terminated their relationship immediately upon learning about David's arrest and criminal charges. Melissa apparently discovered that David had been lying to her about his financial situation and professional prospects, Sarah had mentioned with obvious satisfaction. She'd been expecting to be supported by someone with substantial income and social status, only to discover that his lifestyle was funded through criminal activities that would result in years of prison and financial ruin. Melissa's abandonment of David had been swift and brutal. She'd changed her phone number, blocked his social media accounts, and informed mutual acquaintances that she wanted no contact with someone facing federal prosecution for financial crimes. The woman who'd been willing to facilitate the destruction of David's marriage had shown no loyalty when his criminal activities threatened her own reputation and prospects. The irony wasn't lost on Emma that David had abandoned his wife to pursue a relationship with someone who immediately abandoned him when his criminal behavior was exposed. The pattern revealed something fundamental about David's character and his ability to build authentic relationships with people who understood his true nature. Emma's transformation from abandoned wife to successful independent professional had accelerated significantly in the months following David's arrest and prosecution. Her cooperation with federal investigators had established her reputation as someone whose professional judgment and ethical standards could be trusted by government agencies dealing with sensitive matters. The Commerce Department consulting contract that had seemed so significant when initially offered had become the foundation for expanded relationships with multiple federal agencies that valued Emma's expertise in international business compliance. Her security clearance had been upgraded to accommodate work on classified projects involving national security implications of international business relationships. Her latest project involved analyzing how foreign corporations used American business partnerships to gain unauthorized access to sensitive technology and intellectual property. The work required sophisticated understanding of both international business law and national security policy, expertise that Emma had developed through years of legitimate consulting work that David had consistently undervalued. Emma's analysis of foreign business intelligence operations has been essential to developing policy responses that protect American technological advantages while maintaining open international business relationships. Director James Walsh of the Commerce Department's Office of International Business Security had written in a performance evaluation that would permanently enhance Emma's professional credentials. The recognition from senior government officials had opened opportunities that exceeded anything Emma could have imagined during her marriage to David. She'd been invited to present her research at congressional briefings on international business security, participate in policy development meetings with cabinet-level officials, and contribute to academic conferences on national security and international commerce. Her professional reputation had expanded beyond government consulting to include recognition from academic institutions and private sector organizations that valued her expertise in ethical international business practices. Harvard Business School had invited her to lecture on regulatory compliance in international business expansion. The Council on Foreign Relations had appointed her to a task force on American economic competitiveness in global markets. But the personal satisfaction Emma derived from her professional success was secondary to the deeper fulfillment of living authentically according to her own values and priorities. The woman who'd once structured her life around someone else's career ambitions now made decisions based on her own intellectual interests and ethical commitments. Emma's work schedule, while demanding, was entirely under her control. She chose projects based on their importance and her interest, rather than their convenience for someone else's social obligations. She traveled for professional purposes to locations that enhanced her expertise, rather than supported someone else's networking goals. Her personal relationships had evolved to reflect her authentic interests and values. Instead of corporate wives whose conversations focused on social positioning and husband management, Emma's closest friends were foreign service officers, academic researchers, and policy analysts who shared her commitment to public service and international understanding. Dr. Amanda Foster, a State Department economist whom Emma had met through her embassy consulting work, had become a particularly valued friend, whose intellectual partnership enriched both their professional and personal lives. Their conversations explored complex policy questions and international business challenges that stimulated Emma's thinking and enhanced her professional expertise. Emma, what you've accomplished since your divorce has been remarkable not just professionally but personally, Amanda had observed during one of their regular dinners at a restaurant near George Washington University. You've built a career that serves important public policy objectives while maintaining ethical standards that most people in our field aspire to but few achieve. Amanda's perspective was particularly valuable because she understood both the professional challenges Emma faced and the personal courage required to rebuild her life after exposing her husband's criminal activities. As someone who'd spent 15 years in government service, Amanda recognized that Emma's cooperation with federal investigators had required personal sacrifice that many people wouldn't have been willing to make. Not everyone would have chosen to expose criminal activities that implicated their own spouse, Amanda continued. Your decision required both moral courage and professional integrity that government agencies notice and remember. That reputation for ethical reliability is more valuable than any specific technical expertise you could develop. Emma's social life had expanded to include cultural and intellectual activities that reflected her authentic interests rather than professional obligations. She'd joined the Kennedy Center's International Arts Program, attending performances and lectures that explored cross-cultural artistic expression. She'd begun studying Mandarin through a State Department language program, developing skills that enhanced both her professional capabilities and personal intellectual growth. The contrast with her married life was stark and liberating. During her marriage to David, evenings and weekends had been dominated by corporate social events, where Emma's role was limited to appearing supportive and making conversation that enhanced David's professional image. Now her personal time belonged entirely to her, filled with activities that stimulated her mind and enriched her understanding of the world. Emma had also begun traveling for personal rather than professional purposes, exploring interests that had nothing to do with business development or networking opportunities. A recent trip to Morocco had combined her interest in international cultures with her passion for photography, resulting in a collection of images that captured the intersection of traditional and modern influences in North African society. The financial independence Emma had achieved through her consulting work provided security and freedom that she'd never experienced during her marriage to David. Her income exceeded what she'd earned as David's wife, and it was entirely under her control, free from the anxiety of wondering whether family finances were being compromised by criminal activities she didn't know about. Emma's new apartment represented financial and personal independence that felt revolutionary after years of living in spaces chosen and decorated according to David's preferences and social ambitions. Every piece of furniture, every artwork, every household decision reflected her own taste and priorities rather than someone else's vision of appropriate image management. The financial security also allowed Emma to make professional choices based on interest and importance rather than immediate income requirements. She'd turned down several lucrative consulting opportunities with private corporations to focus on government work that served broader public policy objectives, choices that would have been difficult when her financial security depended on maximizing short-term income. The federal investigation that Emma's evidence had initiated was nearing completion, with criminal trials scheduled for all 4 primary participants in David's network. Agent Martinez had kept Emma informed about the prosecution timeline and her potential role as a government witness in upcoming criminal proceedings. Ms. Chen, your testimony will be crucial to establishing the prosecution's case against all 4 defendants, Agent Martinez had explained during their most recent briefing. Your evidence provides the foundation for proving criminal intent and demonstrating how the network operated to exploit regulatory gaps while avoiding detection. Emma's role as a key government witness had required extensive preparation with federal prosecutors who would present the case against David and his associates. The preparation process had been thorough and professional, with prosecutors ensuring that Emma understood both the legal significance of her testimony and the personal protections available to government witnesses. Your cooperation with this investigation has been exemplary, Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Davidson had noted during one of their preparation sessions. Your evidence was comprehensive, your analysis was accurate, and your willingness to testify demonstrates the kind of civic responsibility that makes federal prosecution of complex financial crimes possible. The prosecution team had been particularly impressed with the quality and organization of Emma's documentation. Her professional training and analytical presentation had resulted in evidence packages that were immediately usable for federal investigation, saving months of work that would otherwise have been required to establish the basic facts of the criminal enterprise. Ms. Chen's evidence was so well organized and thoroughly documented that it provided our investigation with a complete roadmap of the defendant's criminal activities, Agent Martinez had observed. Her professional expertise in international business analysis made her uniquely qualified to understand and document the sophisticated financial schemes her husband's network was operating. The upcoming criminal trials would provide Emma with an opportunity to publicly testify about David's criminal activities and their impact on her marriage and professional life. While the prospect of courtroom testimony was somewhat daunting, Emma felt prepared and committed to ensuring that justice was served for crimes that had threatened both American business interests and her personal security. The broader implications of the federal investigation had extended far beyond the individual prosecutions of David and his associates. Emma's evidence had revealed systematic vulnerabilities in how American corporations monitored their employees' international business activities, leading to regulatory changes that would affect thousands of companies operating globally. The Securities and Exchange Commission had issued new guidance requiring enhanced reporting of international consulting arrangements that could potentially create conflicts of interest or facilitate regulatory avoidance. The Department of Justice had announced increased enforcement priorities for corporate espionage cases involving American employees who exploited their positions for unauthorized personal gain. The Morrison case has become a landmark investigation that has influenced policy development across multiple federal agencies, Agent Martinez had explained. Your evidence revealed patterns of criminal activity that were apparently widespread throughout American businesses operating internationally, leading to regulatory changes that will help prevent similar schemes in the future. Emma's contribution to these broader policy developments had been recognized through formal commendations from several federal agencies that had used her analysis to understand and address systematic vulnerabilities in international business oversight. Her expertise was increasingly sought by policymakers who were developing regulations to prevent similar criminal enterprises. The recognition from senior government officials had established Emma as a respected expert whose opinions influenced policy decisions at the highest levels of American government. Cabinet-level officials regularly consulted her analysis when developing regulations affecting international business relationships, and her recommendations had been incorporated into formal policy guidance issued by multiple federal agencies. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition had come from other professionals who understood the personal cost of Emma's decision to expose her husband's criminal activities. The Association of Government Consultants had awarded Emma their annual recognition for ethical professional conduct, acknowledging both her professional expertise and her personal courage in prioritizing public interest over family loyalty. Emma Chen's willingness to expose criminal activities that implicated her own spouse demonstrates the highest standards of professional integrity and civic responsibility, the association's citation had read. Her cooperation with federal law enforcement agencies has protected American business interests, while establishing precedent for how professional consultants should respond when they discover criminal activities within their personal relationships. The award ceremony had been attended by senior officials from multiple federal agencies, who had worked with Emma on various consulting projects. Their presence had demonstrated that Emma's reputation for ethical reliability was well established throughout the governmental communities that valued her expertise. Dr. Patricia Williams, the immigration officer who had initially processed Emma's visa application, had been particularly eloquent in describing how Emma's case had influenced her understanding of what immigration policy should recognize and reward. Emma Chen's case demonstrates exactly the kind of character and commitment to American principles that immigration law is designed to identify and welcome, Dr. Williams had said during the award ceremony. Her professional qualifications were impressive, but her willingness to sacrifice personal convenience to uphold legal and ethical standards is what distinguishes her as someone whose presence strengthens American society. The phone call that provided the final punctuation to Emma's transformation came on a Tuesday morning while she was preparing for a meeting with State Department officials about a new consulting project focused on international trade compliance. The project involved analyzing regulatory frameworks in Southeast Asian countries to help American businesses navigate complex requirements while maintaining ethical business practices. Emma, this is Officer Williams from Immigration Services. I wanted to inform you personally that the federal investigation you made possible has resulted in criminal convictions for all 4 primary participants in the financial fraud network. Mr. Morrison was sentenced yesterday to 6 years in federal prison, followed by supervised probation and restitution requirements that will affect him for decades. Emma set down her coffee cup and absorbed the news with a sense of completion rather than celebration. Justice had been served not through revenge or manipulation, but through the natural consequences of David's own choices and actions. The legal system had operated exactly as it was designed to operate, protecting society from criminal behavior while ensuring appropriate punishment for those who violated the law. Officer Williams, thank you for letting me know. I appreciate everything your office did to ensure that the investigation proceeded appropriately and that my cooperation was protected throughout the process. Ms. Chen, I want you to know that your cooperation with federal law enforcement has been noted in your immigration file as an example of exceptional civic responsibility. Your willingness to expose criminal activities at personal risk demonstrates exactly the kind of character and commitment to American principles that immigration policy is designed to recognize and reward. The conversation had continued for several minutes, with Officer Williams providing details about the sentencing hearing and the broader impact of the investigation on federal policy development. David's sentence included not just prison time but substantial financial restitution and probationary requirements that would monitor his activities for years after his release. Mr. Morrison's sentence reflects the serious nature of his crimes and their impact on American business interests, Officer Williams had explained. The financial restitution requirements will ensure that he remains accountable for the economic damage his network caused, while the probationary supervision will prevent him from engaging in similar activities in the future. After ending the call, Emma stood at her apartment windows and reflected on the journey that had brought her from abandoned wife to successful independent professional, whose expertise was valued by American government agencies. The transformation had been both personal and professional, involving not just career advancement but fundamental changes in how she understood her own capabilities and potential. David Morrison had thought he could manipulate her into being grateful for whatever consideration he chose to offer, then discard her when her presence became inconvenient. His calculation had been based on fundamental misunderstanding of both Emma's professional capabilities and her personal character. He'd assumed that abandoning her would demonstrate his control over her future, while protecting himself from regulatory scrutiny that might expose his criminal activities. Instead, his abandonment had freed Emma to pursue opportunities that exceeded anything their marriage could have provided. His criminal activities had been exposed through her evidence and cooperation with federal investigators who had the authority and expertise to ensure appropriate consequences. His professional reputation had been destroyed through his own choices and actions, while Emma's reputation had been enhanced through her cooperation with law enforcement and her commitment to ethical professional conduct. The life Emma was living now, built on her own merit and maintained through her own efforts, was more fulfilling and more authentic than any life she could have achieved as the supportive wife of someone whose success was built on criminal behavior. Her professional achievements reflected her genuine capabilities, rather than her utility as an accessory to someone else's career advancement. Her personal relationships were built on mutual respect and shared values, rather than social positioning or professional networking. Her financial security was entirely under her control, free from anxiety about criminal activities that could expose her to legal liability she never authorized. Her daily choices reflected her own priorities and interests, rather than someone else's expectations about appropriate supporting behavior. Emma Chen had not just survived David Morrison's betrayal, she had used it as the foundation for building something far better than anything he could have offered her. The woman who'd sat terrified in an embassy interview room, abandoned by her husband at the most crucial moment of their immigration process, had become a successful professional, whose expertise was valued by American government agencies, and whose integrity had helped expose a criminal network that threatened American business interests. The contrast between Emma's current life and her married existence was so dramatic that she sometimes wondered whether she'd been living someone else's life during those 3 years with David. The professional opportunities she now enjoyed, the personal relationships she'd developed, and the financial independence she'd achieved all seemed more authentic and more satisfying than anything she'd experienced while trying to be the perfect corporate wife. David Morrison had wanted an audience for Emma's humiliation, but he'd ended up providing an audience for his own destruction. Emma's diplomat friend had intervened, but the real intervention had been Emma's own courage to choose truth over complicity, independence over manipulation, and justice over silence. The immigration interview that was supposed to secure Emma's place as David's dependent wife had instead become the beginning of her liberation from a marriage built on deception and control. David's abandonment, intended to demonstrate his power over her future, had instead demonstrated his own moral bankruptcy to federal officials who had the authority to ensure appropriate consequences. Emma Chen was exactly where she belonged, living independently in America, building a career based on her own qualifications, surrounded by people who respected her judgment and valued her contributions. Her work served important American policy objectives while providing her with intellectual stimulation and professional recognition that reflected her genuine capabilities. David Morrison was exactly where he belonged, facing the consequences of choices that had ultimately destroyed only himself, while leaving Emma free to build the authentic, successful life she'd always been capable of achieving when freed from his manipulation and control. The future that stretched ahead of Emma was entirely her own to shape, built on foundations of professional excellence, personal integrity, and commitment to public service that would continue to create opportunities for growth and contribution. She'd discovered that her authentic self was far more capable and resilient than the diminished version she'd become during her marriage, to someone who'd never understood or appreciated her actual value. Standing in her apartment that Tuesday morning, Watching the sun rise over Washington, D.C. while contemplating the meeting that would launch her next major consulting project, Emma felt profound gratitude for the chain of events that had brought her to this moment. David's abandonment had been the catalyst, but her own choices and actions had created the life she was now living. The woman who'd been afraid to challenge her husband's dismissive attitude toward her work had become someone whose professional judgment influenced policy decisions at the highest levels of American government. The wife who'd structured her life around someone else's career ambitions had become an independent professional whose expertise was sought by multiple federal agencies. Most importantly, the person who'd allowed someone else to define her worth and potential had discovered that her authentic capabilities exceeded anything she'd imagined possible during the years when she'd accepted limitations imposed by someone else's insecurity and need for control. Emma Chen had found her true home in America, not as someone's dependent spouse but as an independent professional whose work served important national interests, while providing her with the intellectual challenges and personal fulfillment she'd always sought. The life she was building would continue to grow and evolve according to her own choices and ambitions, free from anyone else's limitations or expectations. David Morrison's greatest mistake hadn't been abandoning his wife at an immigration interview. His greatest mistake had been underestimating who she really was, and what she was capable of achieving when given the freedom to pursue her own potential. That mistake had cost him everything, while giving Emma the opportunity to discover everything she could become. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.